She's just the numbers girl. See her with the staff. Harper's voice sliced through the air, smooth and deliberate, loud enough for half the room to hear. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I calculated. My mother adjusted her pearls, eyes fixed on the flowers. My father studied the dance floor. And Daniel, my own brother, stood frozen beside his bride, lips pressed but silent. That silence was louder than her insult. They thought I was invisible, the sister who fetched coffee in boardrooms. They forgot I was the woman holding the final signature on the $40 million merger they were parading tonight. So, I smiled, reached for my phone. 3 words, steady and sharp. Cancel the deal. Glasses trembled, chairs scraped, futures cracked. I didn't scream. I didn't explain. I walked out and took their empire with me. And if you think that was the climax, oh, we're just getting started. Stay with me. My name is Isabella Tran, and at 29, I have built the kind of life my family never believed I could. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Seattle condo, I could see the waters of Elliott Bay stretch out like a sheet of glass, reflecting the skyline I had quietly carved my place into. To most, that view symbolized success. To me, it was a reminder of how far I had come and how far I had been pushed away. By day, I was the chief financial officer of a fast-growing fintech firm. Numbers weren't just my job. They were my armor. Spreadsheets didn't lie. Balance sheets didn't play favorites. Unlike people, numbers didn't look at me and see the spare child. They told the truth, even when my family never did. My colleagues respected me, investors trusted me, and my signature carried weight in rooms where billions moved. Yet at every family dinner, at every holiday, I was still treated like the girl in the corner, too quiet to matter, too serious to celebrate. Work, success, loneliness. That was my rhythm. I'd built routines that kept me grounded. Morning runs along Alki Beach, late-night emails that bled into dawn, black coffee cooling untouched beside my laptop. The condo was silent, save for the hum of the city below. That silence could be comforting. But some nights it pressed against my chest like a weight, because no matter how much I achieved, there was a part of me that still craved something simple. Acknowledgement, not applause, not even praise. Just the recognition that I wasn't invisible. But invisibility had its uses. It made me observant. It made me deliberate. It made me the kind of strategist who could walk into a collapsing company and quietly pull the right levers until everything worked again. My family, however, mistook that quiet for weakness. They always had. Daniel, my older brother by 3 years, had been the golden boy since birth. Loud, charming, careless. He filled every room with noise while I was the shadow cleaning up his messes. He was the face. I was the foundation. He got the spotlight. I got the silence. And over time, that silence became the air I breathed. Still, I loved them once. I wanted to belong at their table, even if it meant shrinking myself to fit. I wanted to believe that blood meant loyalty, that family meant protection. But loyalty without respect is just chains. And protection that erases you is another form of prison. Deep down, I knew it. Yet I still held on to threads of hope, thin, fraying threads, that one day they would see me. That's why I arrived at Daniel's wedding in Austin 15 minutes early. Not out of excitement. Out of respect. That word had always defined me. Respect for family, even when it wasn't returned. Respect for the legacy my father had built, even when my name was erased from it. Respect for myself, though I was still learning what that meant. As I crossed the marble lobby of the Fairmont Hotel, my heels clicking softly against the polished floor, I thought about how different my 2 worlds were. In one, I was Isabella Tran, the CFO with deals stacked in her inbox, the woman investors requested by name. In the other, I was just Izzy, the sister who could be sidelined, ignored, dismissed. Two lives, one body, colliding under chandeliers that night. I didn't know then that my silence was about to end, that the girl they seated by the kitchen would burn their empire down. What I did know was this: invisibility had been my curse, but it was also my greatest weapon. And when the time came, I would use it. I grew up in Houston, Texas, in a 2-story brick house with a magnolia tree shading the front yard. To outsiders, it looked picture perfect. A tidy lawn, a polished family, a son destined for greatness. Inside, the picture was less perfect, because greatness was reserved for Daniel. From the time we were children, the roles were scripted. Daniel, 3 years older, was the golden boy. He could walk into a room and everyone leaned in, waiting for the next joke, the next story. Teachers adored him. Neighbors called him charismatic. My parents called him our pride. Me? I was the quiet one. Not because I was shy, but because I had learned early that my words carried no weight. I brought home straight A's, science fair trophies, and debate ribbons. They gathered dust in a shoebox under my bed because no one came to see me win them. Daniel once hit a C+ in algebra, and my mother hired a tutor the next day. When I asked for help with my college essays, my father waved a hand. "You'll figure it out, Izzy. You always do." Daniel, meanwhile, had 3 adults editing his drafts and a private counselor polishing his interview skills. It wasn't that they hated me. I don't think they even realized what they were doing. Love in our house was measured in attention, and Daniel always had all of it. The rest of us revolved around his orbit. I still remember Thanksgiving when I was 16. Daniel borrowed my car, drove drunk, and plowed into a neighbor's fence. My parents cried, scolded, then turned to me. "Why didn't you stop him?" they demanded. I was 3 hours away at a debate competition. It didn't matter. I was expected to be the responsible one, the fixer. His mistakes became my burdens, his spotlight my shadow. Even at the dinner table, the pattern never changed. Daniel would arrive late, tell half-truths about his day, and everyone laughed. I tried once to mention an idea for a nonprofit incubator I dreamed of starting. My mother interrupted mid-sentence to pass the salt. My father asked Daniel about football practice. Laughter drowned me out. That was the night I realized some tables aren't set for you. You're just expected to serve quietly and move on. Inside, I wrestled with it. Was I too serious? Too quiet? Not charming enough? Maybe if I laughed more, or dressed brighter, or talked louder, they would see me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about flaws. It was about roles assigned too early, too rigidly, and never questioned. Daniel was the future. I was the fallback. He was the face. I was the foundation. And still, I wanted to believe. I clung to the thread that maybe one day, grief or crisis would clear their vision. That one day they would look at me and finally see, not the quiet one, but the capable one. Foreshadowing came early. When my father launched Lone Star Energy, Daniel was handed a desk, a title, and a box of business cards. I offered to help. Accounting, operations, even investor pitches. My father smiled thinly. "We'll call you when we need you." They didn't. Not until years later when everything was burning. Looking back, I realize those years taught me something invaluable. Silence can be sharper than sound. Every dismissal, every overlooked victory, every moment I was erased. It was engraving itself into me, a quiet ledger of injustice. I didn't know then how heavy that ledger would become. I didn't know that one day in a ballroom filled with chandeliers, it would all balance out in 3 words. When my father died, the family gathered in Lone Star Energy's glass-walled boardroom. Grief still hung heavy, but beneath it was calculation. The question wasn't, how do we heal? It was who got control. The answer came faster than I expected. The board announced Daniel as CEO. No discussion, no debate. Just a smooth vote and polite applause. I wasn't offered an interim role. I wasn't even invited to the follow-up meeting. Instead, I was thanked for my insights, patted on the shoulder, and dismissed with words that stung sharper than silence. Your contributions are invaluable behind the scenes. Behind the scenes? That had always been my prison. I watched Daniel step into the spotlight wearing our father's cufflinks, his jaw set like a king inheriting a throne. Cameras flashed. Reporters wrote headlines about the young visionary leading Lone Star into the future. Not one article mentioned me. Not one photograph showed the nights I sat hunched over financial statements, the quiet audits that kept the company afloat when recession nearly drowned us. The truth? Lone Star had been 30 days from collapse when my father fell ill. Payroll dangling, vendors unpaid, investors restless. Daniel panicked. He called me at midnight, his voice breaking. "Izzy, I don't know what to do." I did. I pulled together emergency audits, uncovered duplicate vendors bleeding us dry, renegotiated contracts, and convinced 2 investors, people I had cultivated relationships with for years, that Lone Star could still rise. I wasn't on the letterhead, but I was the one who bought them time. 3 weeks later, a $15 million infusion arrived. Payroll cleared. The lights stayed on. Daniel smiled for the cameras. My name vanished into the shadows. That was the dramatic irony of my life. I was the architect of their survival, yet to the world, I was a ghost. I thought maybe, after my father's funeral, things would shift. Maybe grief would soften them, bring clarity. But instead, it hardened into erasure. Daniel signed documents alone. My mother echoed every decision. The board treated me as a courtesy presence. Even my suggestions were met with polite nods and no follow-through. One evening, Daniel called me into his office. The city skyline glowed behind him, a backdrop for the performance he'd perfected. "You know how this works," he said, smoothing his tie. "You're brilliant, Izzy, but it's about image. I'm the face. You're support." Support. That word landed like a verdict. Inside, anger flared, but it tangled with something heavier. Doubt. Was I selfish for wanting credit? Was I wrong to expect more than silence? I pushed the questions down. Out loud, I said nothing. Out loud, I stayed invisible. But in the quiet of my condo, staring out at Elliott Bay, I felt the weight of betrayal settle deeper. My family didn't just fail to see me, they deliberately chose not to. They built their empire on my silence, and I let them. That realization cut sharper than any insult Harper would throw years later. Shock, anger, resolve. It was the rule of 3 that defined that season of my life. Shock at how easily they erased me. Anger at how willingly I played along. Resolve that one day, when the right moment came, I wouldn't just ask for recognition. I would take it. And that moment was closer than they ever imagined. The first time I saw the contract, my hands shook. It wasn't the numbers. They lined up perfectly, as they always did in my world. It was the fine print, the clause buried deep inside the bylaws, that named me co-founder and required my signature before Lone Star could finalize the $40 million merger with Collins Capital. After years of erasure, there it was. My name, hidden in legal language, the last lock they couldn't pick without me. For a moment, I almost laughed, not with joy, but with recognition. They had built their empire on my silence, but now their future rested on my voice. I spread the papers across my desk in my Seattle condo. The city glowed outside the glass, traffic weaving red and white veins across the night. A half-empty mug of coffee sat cold beside me, untouched for hours. My fingers traced the black ink, the legalese that spelled out their intentions. On the surface, it was simple. Sign, and the company would be saved. but the weight behind it pressed on my chest like a stone. Signing meant chaining myself back into a role I had never chosen. Support, background, invisible. Then the email came. Subject line, FW, signature confirmation. I almost ignored it, assuming it was a scheduling note. But then my eyes caught the internal thread. Harper had written to Daniel, confident, careless, and cruel. Once she signs, she's irrelevant. 10 words, sharp enough to slice through years of tolerance. My chest tightened as I read them again. Slower this time, hoping they might shift, soften, reveal nuance. They didn't. They stayed smug and final. The kind of words people only write when they're sure you'll never fight back. My vision tunneled. My breath hitched. My fingers trembled over the keys. For a moment, I nearly broke. All those years of swallowing silence came flooding back. The science fair trophies no one applauded. The Thanksgiving where Daniel wrecked a car and I was blamed. The board meetings where I carried the weight and watched him claim the credit. Each memory pressed against me until I thought my ribs might crack. And the question surfaced, raw and heavy. Was I selfish for choosing myself? Was I cruel for thinking of refusing my own blood? I sat back in the leather chair, staring at the skyline. The moonlight reflected off Elliott Bay, fractured by the glass-like pieces of a puzzle. My reflection stared back at me. Hair pulled loose from a long day, eyes red-rimmed, lips pressed thin. I didn't look like power. I looked like exhaustion. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, something harder stirred. The trembling in my hands slowed. My spine straightened. My breath deepened. I remembered my father's voice when I was 12, stern but certain. Discipline makes power. Without it, power curdles. He had never said those words to Daniel. He said them to me. And though he chose his golden son in the end, he had still written my name into the foundation. That clause wasn't an accident. It was the echo of a recognition he never voiced out loud. A hidden acknowledgement that the quiet one mattered. The laughter from Daniel's wedding rehearsal dinner replayed in my head. Their smug smiles, their careful dismissal. Harper's words bled into my ears again. She's just the numbers girl. They believed silence meant surrender. They mistook patience for obedience. They thought I would always sign. They were wrong. I closed the folder carefully, pressing the papers flat with both palms. The pen lay beside it, silver, gleaming, heavy as a verdict. One stroke could give them everything. One pause could take it away. I let my hand hover, then pulled back. Not tonight. Not this time. I whispered into the stillness, my voice steadier than it had ever been. No more. The condo was silent, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't the suffocating kind that erased me. It was the sharpened kind, the kind that waits, calculates, and prepares. The city pulsed below, oblivious to the storm gathering in my chest. And I knew, in that moment, I would not be their pawn again. The evidence was in my hands, their empire hung by a thread. And for the first time, I was the one holding the scissors. The next morning, Daniel called. His name lit up my phone like a warning. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was too smooth, too rehearsed. Izzy, we need to finalize everything today. The Collins team is expecting your signature by noon. Expecting, not asking. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, staring out at the gray Seattle sky. Why is it always about what they expect, Daniel? What about what I want? Silence hummed across the line. Then a chuckle, forced. Don't start. You know this is bigger than you. It's about saving the company. About family. Family. That word again, wielded like a weapon. When I didn't answer, he shifted gears, voice sharper. Don't make this difficult. Harper's family has money, connections, and power. If you care about Lone Star, if you care about Dad's legacy, you'll sign. It's just a formality. A formality. My breath caught in my chest. Last night's email echoed in my skull. Once she signs, she's irrelevant. I'm not a formality, I said, my voice low, steady. I'm the reason Lone Star still exists. His laugh came quick, dismissive. Come on, don't rewrite history. Dad built Lone Star. I carried it forward. You were helpful, sure, but let's not exaggerate. Anger flared hot in my throat, but I forced it into words sharp enough to cut. When the market collapsed and you were hiding in your office, who renegotiated contracts? Who brought in new investors? Who cleaned up the mess while you smiled for cameras? His silence was confirmation. He knew. Finally, he exhaled, slow and tired. Look, Izzy, you're smart. I've never denied that. But optics matter. The world sees me as the face of Lone Star. That's how it works. You want credit? Fine. I'll mention you in the press release after the deal closes. How's that? A mention. Like a footnote. Like a ghost. Inside, the old wound split open again. Was I selfish for wanting more than a line in a press release? Was I cruel for not settling for scraps? My pulse thudded in my ears, but under it all, something harder pulsed back. Resolve. I don't need your mention, I said. I need respect. And if you can't give me that, then maybe you don't deserve my signature. His voice rose, sharp now, panic leaking through the cracks. Izzy, don't play games. You think you're punishing me, but you'll destroy everything. Harper's family will walk. The board will collapse. You'll ruin Lone Star. Is that what you want? To be the sister who killed her own father's company? The accusation hit hard. My chest tightened. Images flashed. Dad's hand on my shoulder when I was 12, his voice telling me discipline makes power. His grave, freshly turned earth. The weight of his name carved into stone. Would refusing to sign make me the villain? Would walking away mean betraying him? I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter, nails digging into my palm. No, Daniel. Lone Star was never mine to kill. It was yours to lose. And you've been losing it for years. A sharp inhale on the other end, then his tone shifted again. Desperate now. Please, just think about it. We'll make this right. Harper's family will respect you once you sign. They'll see your value. But I already knew the truth. I had read Harper's words. Respect wasn't in their vocabulary. Control was. I ended the call without another word. My hand trembled as I set the phone down, but it wasn't weakness. It was rage, sharpening into clarity. Hours later, I sat in the Lone Star boardroom in Austin, flown down at Daniel's insistence. The long oak table gleamed under fluorescent lights. Harper sat beside him, her smile polished, her eyes cold. Around them, board members shuffled papers, murmuring about projections. When I entered, every head turned. For once, the silence was about me. Daniel stood, gesturing broadly. Here she is, the woman who keeps the numbers running. Izzy, we're all counting on you. His voice dripped with charm, but I heard the edge beneath it. Don't embarrass me. I took my seat slowly, sliding the folder onto the table. The pen lay across it, silver, waiting. Harper leaned closer, her perfume sharp, her whisper venom wrapped in honey. It'll all be over once you sign. You'll thank us later. I turned to look her in the eyes, and for the first time, I didn't see a rival. I saw a woman who underestimated me. A woman who thought silence was compliance. My lips curved into a small, cold smile. I'll sign, I said softly, letting the words hang, letting Daniel exhale in relief, letting Harper smirk. Then I added, but not today. The room froze. Chairs creaked. Daniel's jaw clenched. Harper's eyes narrowed. I rose slowly, gathering the folder back into my arms. You wanted me invisible, but invisibility cuts both ways. You won't see me coming when it matters most. And with that, I walked out, heels striking the marble, every step a countdown. I didn't go back to my condo that night. Instead, I checked into a quiet boutique hotel off Congress Avenue, the kind with dim lighting and too many books stacked in the lobby, a place where anonymity felt like armor. I needed space to breathe, to think, to pull apart the threads of the trap they were weaving. At 2 a.m, my phone buzzed. It was Marcus, a lawyer who had worked with Lone Star years ago and still owed me a favor. His voice was low, cautious. "Izzy, I just saw something in the merger draft. Thought you'd want to know before you sign." I sat upright, heart pounding. "What is it?" He hesitated, then exhaled. "They slipped in an amendment, tucked into the appendix. Once the merger closes, all strategic decisions require joint approval from the CEO and the governing co-founder. That's you. But here's the kicker. If you ever withdraw consent, your rights transfer automatically to Harper as Daniel's spouse, permanently." The words hit like a fist. I pressed the phone harder against my ear. "That's not just partnership, that's exile." "Exactly," Marcus said. "They're making sure your signature keeps you useful for a minute, then hands control to her. You'd be locked out. Forever." The room tilted. My vision swam. I scrambled for the documents I'd carried out earlier, flipping pages with shaking hands. There it was. Legal jargon so dense it looked harmless. A line most people would skim past, but not me. I'd been trained to find cracks in numbers, and this one gaped like a chasm. I whispered it aloud, tasting the betrayal in every syllable. They planned to use me, then erase me. Images flashed in my head. Harper's icy whisper at the boardroom table, Daniel's desperate plea for family loyalty, my mother's silence, my father's ghost watching from the walls of Lone Star. It all locked into place. This wasn't oversight. It wasn't an accident. It was calculated. They had designed my disappearance. I remembered the email Harper had accidentally copied me on. Once she signs, she's irrelevant. Now I understood why she'd been so smug, because on paper, she'd already stolen my voice. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the glowing city skyline outside my window. I thought of Dad, of the empire he'd built, of the claws he'd left behind tying me to its foundation. Had he meant it as protection? Or had he simply assumed I would always stay silent, always carry the weight without question? I didn't know. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to hand Harper my father's legacy gift-wrapped. The betrayal burned deeper because it wasn't just Daniel anymore. It was Harper, sliding into the cracks of our family, weaving herself into contracts, replacing me piece by piece until even the law wouldn't remember my name. Inside, I wrestled with the old question again. Was I selfish for choosing myself? Was I cruel for thinking of burning it all down? My chest ached with the weight of it, but selfishness is when you take more than you've earned. Cruelty is when you erase someone's existence. That wasn't me. That was them. I laid the papers flat, smoothing them with trembling palms. The pen gleamed beside me like a dare. One signature, and I would be erased. One refusal, and I would become the threat they never expected. That was when another thought slid in, cold and sharp. Harper thought she knew the game. Daniel thought he held the crown, but neither of them knew the network I had been quietly building for years, the founders, the startups, the investments I'd nurtured under my own name. They believed I was still the fallback. They didn't know I had become the alternative. My phone buzzed again. Marcus, this time with a file. "I'm sending you a copy of the full draft with annotations. Don't let them corner you. If you need me, I'm in your corner." His words steadied me. For the first time in years, someone wasn't asking for my silence. They were offering support. I closed my eyes, letting the truth settle. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was structural, legal, permanent. They hadn't simply ignored me, they had built a machine to erase me, and machines, once exposed, can be dismantled. When I opened my eyes again, the city lights had blurred into streaks of gold and red. My heart slowed. My breath steadied. The tremor in my fingers stopped. I wasn't going to be Harper's placeholder. I wasn't going to be Daniel's insurance policy. I was going to be their undoing. The next morning, I walked out of the hotel into the humid Austin air, the contract tucked under my arm like evidence in a trial. I wasn't nervous anymore. I was certain. And certainty is heavier than fear. They thought the wedding would crown them as untouchable. They thought my silence would seal their empire. But now I held the proof that their empire was nothing more than paper, and I was ready to set it on fire. The file Marcus sent sat open on my laptop long after sunrise. The hotel curtains leaked pale light, painting the papers in a dull gray glow. Every clause, every footnote, every trap was underlined in red. They had built a cage for me, polished it with gold, and expected me to lock myself inside. My name was the key, but once I turned it, I would vanish. I stared at the pen lying across the desk, silver and cold. My father's voice echoed from years ago. Discipline makes power. For so long I believed discipline meant endurance, swallowing humiliation, outworking everyone, never demanding credit. But now, staring at Harper's smug handwriting and Daniel's desperate signature lines, I understood. Discipline wasn't about endurance, it was about timing, knowing when to stay silent, and when to strike. Inside, I wrestled again with the old question. Was I selfish for walking away? Was I betraying my father's memory by refusing to save Lone Star? I pictured his grave, the stone carved with his name, the company logo etched beside it. I whispered into the empty room, "Dad, you gave Daniel the title, but you gave me the foundation. You wrote my name in the contract. You knew." My chest ached. But this time the ache felt different. Not guilt, clarity. I opened a locked folder on my laptop, one no one at Lone Star knew existed. Spreadsheets bloomed across the screen, neat columns of investments, partnerships, and holdings under the quiet banner of Harbor North. I had built it in the shadows, brick by brick, while Daniel chased headlines. Startups that no one believed in but me. Founders who thanked me by name when no one else would. Fintech, logistics, property, even a small medical company, pieces of a lattice strong enough to stand on its own. They thought I was dependent on Lone Star. The truth was, Lone Star had been dependent on me. The realization settled like steel in my spine. I didn't need to save Lone Star. I didn't need their empire. I had my own. I drafted an email to Marcus. Hold everything. Do not release my signature. Prepare contingency contracts under Harbor North. My fingers moved steadily. No hesitation. Each keystroke felt like a blade severing me from years of chains. But before I hit send, my phone buzzed. Daniel again. His voice burst through, frantic. "Izzy, where are you? Collins Capital is waiting. They need your signature this morning." I stayed quiet for a long moment, letting his panic bleed into the silence. Finally, I said, calm and deliberate, "Do you want the truth, Daniel? The only reason Collins even trusts Lone Star is because of me. Not you, not Harper. Me. And you've treated me like a ghost." He tried to interrupt, but I didn't let him. "You've built everything on my silence, but silence cuts both ways. This time, it won't protect you. It will bury you." I ended the call before he could answer. My hand trembled, not with fear, but with release. For years, I had played the role they wrote for me, the fallback, the fixer, the invisible sister. But now, I was rewriting the script. I hit send on the email to Marcus, hold everything. The hours that followed blurred. I packed my things slowly, deliberately, each motion heavier than it should have been. My heels clicked against the marble floor of the hotel lobby as I checked out. The receptionist smiled politely, unaware that the papers in my bag carried the weight of an empire's future. Outside, Austin's air was humid, sticky with the promise of storm. Cars hummed past, people bustled in and out of coffee shops, oblivious. I stood still, clutching the folder to my chest, and felt the shift inside me solidify. I wasn't scared anymore. I wasn't doubtful. I was certain. For the first time, the choice was mine. Not theirs, not Harper's, not Daniel's. Mine. I whispered it to myself like a vow. I will not sign. I will not disappear. I will not be erased. And in that vow, I felt the weight lift. The countdown had started. The wedding was days away. They thought I would stand by quietly, pen in hand, chained to their narrative. But when the music swelled and the chandeliers glittered, I would be ready. And what they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that by then, I wouldn't just be the sister they underestimated. I would be the storm they never saw coming. The wedding day dawned hot and bright, the kind of Texas morning that left the air heavy and unrelenting. From the outside, the Collins estate glittered like a magazine spread. Orchids lining the walkway, waiters in white carrying trays of champagne, violins spilling Mozart into the air. Guests in polished suits and sequined gowns drifted through the gardens, laughing too loudly, pretending this was about love and not leverage. I arrived on time, not early, not late, just enough to be noticed but not invited. My heels clicked across the stone path as ushers checked invitations, their eyes sliding over me too quickly, their smiles rehearsed. One pointed me vaguely toward the back. "Your seat is being arranged," he muttered, avoiding my gaze. I knew what that meant. Inside the ballroom, the chandeliers glowed like molten gold, tables sparkled with crystal glassware and linen folded into swans. But when I scanned the elegant seating chart with its perfect calligraphy, my name was missing. A wedding planner, clipboard in hand, gave me a too bright smile. "Miss Tran, you'll be at table 16, toward the back near the kitchen doors. Some late adjustments." Late adjustments, the same euphemism they had used my entire life. I walked to the back of the room, past rows of tables where cousins smirked into their champagne, aunts whispered behind manicured hands, and former family friends offered tight-lipped smiles that vanished as soon as I passed. Table 16 wobbled against the swinging kitchen doors. The tablecloth was creased, the silverware mismatched, the chair uneven. I sat slowly, deliberately, spine straight, face calm. The smell of garlic and roasted lamb wafted out with every swing of the doors, mingling with laughter that wasn't meant for me. Then I heard her voice. Harper, radiant in lace and jewels, paused just long enough for her words to carry across the room. "She's just the numbers girl. Let her eat with the staff." Her tone was smooth, icy, and deliberate. Laughter rippled through nearby tables, soft and cruel. I turned slowly, meeting her gaze as she clung to Daniel's arm. My mother adjusted the ribbon on a flower arrangement. My father studied the floor. Daniel raised his glass, his eyes sliding past mine as if I weren't even there. That silence, that complicity, was sharper than any insult Harper could craft. I felt the sting rise behind my eyes, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of tears. Instead, I smiled. Not a polite smile, not a forced one, a cold, sharp curve of lips that felt like a blade. I reached into my clutch, fingers steady, pulse calm. My phone slid into my palm, its weight familiar, reassuring. I pressed one contact. The line clicked once. A voice answered, "Yes?" My reply was soft, clear, and final. "Cancel the deal. Draft under Harbor North instead. Atlas is dead." 3 sentences, 12 words, enough to set fire to everything they thought was theirs. Around me, nothing shifted at first. Waiters still carried trays. Guests still laughed. Violins still sang. But then I saw it. The ripple. Daniel's phone buzzed on the table, message after message lighting the screen. His smirk faltered, color draining from his cheeks. Harper leaned in, whispering sharp questions. He didn't answer. His hand gripped the stem of his glass until it trembled. My mother frowned, sensing something but not daring to ask. My father narrowed his eyes, pride warring with confusion. And then the sound cut through it all. The scrape of a chair, loud against the polished floor. Warren Collins, Harper's father, stood. His jaw was set, his cufflinks gleaming under the chandelier. He adjusted his jacket, glanced once at Daniel, and said flatly, "I don't do business with amateurs." Then he turned, signaling for his driver, and walked out. His entourage followed like shadows. The silence he left behind was thunderous. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Aunts whispered louder. Reporters who had been invited for photo ops sensed blood in the water. Daniel rose abruptly, knocking over his chair. His voice cracked, desperate. "Izzy, what did you do?" I lifted my glass of water, unhurried, and met his eyes across the room. I reminded them who really built the empire. The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They carried, sharp as glass, echoing through the stunned room. Harper's smile collapsed. My mother's pearls trembled against her collarbone. Cousins stared at their plates. And Daniel, the golden boy, the face of Lone Star, looked like a boy watching his castle burn. I stood slowly, pushing back my uneven chair. No hurry, no panic. I walked past rows of shocked faces, each step steady, each heel clicking like a drumbeat. I didn't flinch when whispers swelled or when cameras flashed. I didn't look back. At the doors, I paused, not for effect, but because I wanted the truth to sink in. They had always believed they could bury me in silence. Tonight, I buried them with it. I stepped outside into the humid night air, the chaos inside spilling into muffled shouts behind me. Fireflies glowed faintly along the garden hedges, oblivious to the empire crumbling under chandeliers. I inhaled deeply, the scent of jasmine mixing with the sharp bite of freedom. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. Lone Star was dead, and I had killed it. By morning, the whispers from the wedding had hardened into headlines. Collins Capital pulls out of Lone Star merger. Golden Boy CEO humiliated at the altar. Empire crumbles in public meltdown. The photographs were merciless. Daniel pale and sweating, Harper's smile cracking, my mother clutching her pearls, Warren Collins storming out. One image showed me walking away, head high, a glass of water in my hand. They called it the calm before the collapse. The fallout came fast. Lone Star stock plummeted 20% before lunch and another 15% by closing. Phones that once rang with congratulations now went dead. Vendors demanded guarantees Daniel couldn't give. Directors stopped returning calls. A board meeting scheduled to stabilize the company ended with half the seats empty and the other half silent. By the second day, Collins's lawyers filed withdrawal notices, and by the third, analysts called Lone Star a sinking ship. My own phone didn't stop buzzing. Daniel left voicemails, his voice swinging from fury to desperation. "You've ruined everything, Izzy. Do you feel powerful now?" Then later, broken and pleading, "Please, just talk to me. We can fix this." I didn't answer. I listened once, then pressed delete. Mother called too. Her tone wasn't angry, it was wounded, panicked. "Why would you do this to your own family?" she asked, her voice shaking. I let the silence stretch before answering. "Because you let me sit by the kitchen." There was nothing after that, just breathing, shallow and stunned. For the first time in her life, she had no words. Inside, I wrestled with the weight of it. Was I cruel? Was I selfish for letting Lone Star burn? Was I betraying Dad by refusing to save the company he built? The guilt pressed heavily, but beneath it, another truth pulsed louder. They had never given me loyalty, never given me respect. They had expected me to sign away my life, and when I refused, the empire collapsed under its own arrogance. That wasn't murder. That was a consequence. I sat by the window of my condo in Seattle, looking out at Elliott Bay, the skyline flickering with restless energy. The city moved on, oblivious to the chaos unraveling in Texas, and in that distance I found clarity. I hadn't destroyed Lone Star. I had simply stopped saving it. And without me, it had no foundation. The thought didn't bring joy. It didn't bring triumph. It brought relief. A quiet exhale after years of suffocating silence. My reflection in the glass looked different. Harder, sharper, steadier. The girl who once begged for acknowledgement was gone. In her place stood a woman who had learned that self-worth doesn't come from their approval. It comes from drawing a line and refusing to step back over it. But the question lingered, one that wasn't just mine, but universal. When family betrays you, do you stay silent for the sake of blood? Or do you fight back for the sake of your worth? So I'll ask you right now as you listen, are you Team Isabella, the one who finally said no, or Team Daniel, who claims family loyalty should excuse betrayal? Comment below. Choose your side, because silence is a choice, and so is justice. The headlines would fade, the markets would move on. But what happened in that ballroom, under chandeliers and laughter, wasn't just about contracts or companies. It was about the cost of silence and the power of finally breaking it. And though the world saw me as the woman who killed Lone Star, I knew the truth. I hadn't ended something. I had begun. The storm had only just started. The week after the wedding, Lone Star imploded in real time. News anchors dissected Daniel's collapse on national television, flashing side-by-side images of his tuxedoed grin at the altar and the plunging red lines of the stock ticker. Pundits used words he had once thrown at me: mismanagement, incompetence, betrayal. Every insult they had buried in silence now clung to his name like a brand. I watched it all unfold from the corner office of Harbor North, sunlight spilling across my desk. The headlines didn't sting, they steadied me. For years, I had been the ghost behind Lone Star's curtain. Now, for the first time, I was visible. On my own terms. The founders I had quietly supported began calling one by one. Maya and Louise from the fintech startup sent a bottle of champagne with a handwritten note. "Thank you for believing in us before anyone else did." Ruth, who turned abandoned warehouses into clinics, texted a picture of a crowded ribbon cutting, her smile wide, her team clapping behind her. Ahmed, who had built the payment rail for tradesmen, called just to say, "Payroll cleared again this week, because of you." Their victories were mine, stitched into the lattice I had built in silence. And now that silence was over. I called Marcus, my lawyer, and gave him the final instruction. Transfer all pending contracts under Harbor North. Any vendor tied to Lone Star who wants stability, send them my way. His reply was crisp. "Already done." They're lining up. One by one, the pillars that had once propped up Daniel's empire shifted to mine. Logistics partners, data vendors, property managers. They all called me, not him. They didn't care about his last name anymore. They cared about results. And I had been the one delivering all along. Still, I wrestled inside. Was I ruthless? Was I cruel for stripping what little Daniel had left? My chest tightened, but this time the weight felt lighter. Because I wasn't taking what wasn't mine. I was reclaiming what had always been mine. In the middle of it all, an email arrived from Collins Capital. Not from Harper, not from her father, but from Warren himself. It was one line, blunt as a hammer. "If you're interested in talking, we'd rather deal with you directly." I stared at the words, then laughed softly. The irony was exquisite. The very family who had tried to erase me now wanted to negotiate with me. I didn't respond immediately. Power isn't loud. Power is patience. By Friday, Lone Star's offices were half empty, employees fleeing uncertainty. Daniel held a press conference under harsh studio lights, sweat glistening on his forehead as he stammered about resilience, loyalty, second chances. Behind him, screens showed collapsing numbers. Reporters shouted questions about betrayal, about family fractures. His voice cracked. Cameras caught everything, and I knew. The empire that had been built on my silence was gone. That night, I stood by the glass wall of my office, the city glittering below. My reflection stared back, sharper, steadier, unshaken. The girl who once sat invisible at family dinners was gone. In her place stood the woman who had said 3 words and brought an empire to its knees. Work, justice, freedom. The rule of 3 defined my new life. I lifted a glass of water, cool and clear, and whispered into the skyline. I stood up for myself. I reclaimed my worth. And for the first time, I felt the truth settle deep, solid, and unshakable. The courtroom wasn't necessary. The press didn't need my testimony. The contract spoke louder than I ever could. I had already won. After Lone Star's collapse, the calls and headlines eventually quieted. What remained wasn't chaos. It was silence. But this silence felt different, lighter, almost like air after a storm. I moved from my Seattle condo to a loft in San Francisco, glass walls opening to the bay, the city buzzing with energy that matched my own. It wasn't about running away from Texas. It was about starting somewhere that didn't carry ghosts. The first night in my new place, I sat on the floor surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, sipping tea, listening to the hum of the city. For once, I didn't feel invisible. I felt free. Harbor North grew quickly, not in headlines but in substance. Startups that once begged for scraps now had steady funding. Founders I had believed in sent updates that made me smile. New clinics opening, jobs created, technology finally reaching people who needed it most. Every report reminded me of something simple. Impact doesn't come from recognition, it comes from resilience. And I had plenty of that. But healing wasn't just about work, it was about people. Mackenzie Carter from Compass House called one evening. "We're hosting a support dinner," she said. "You should come. No business, just stories." I almost refused out of habit, but something in her voice convinced me. That night, I sat at a long table surrounded by strangers who weren't strangers at all. They were survivors, dreamers, people who knew what it felt like to be dismissed and still choose to stand. One woman, Rachel Morgan, leaned over and said, "Family isn't who shares your blood, it's who respects your worth." Her words sank into me deeper than any contract. Inside, I still wrestled with old doubts. Was I selfish for cutting them off? Could healing mean reconciliation, or only distance? I journaled late at night, pages filled with messy reflections. But the more I wrote, the clearer it became. I didn't owe them silence anymore, and I didn't owe them forgiveness either. Forgiveness, if it came, would be mine to choose, not theirs to demand. One Sunday morning, I ran along the Embarcadero, the sun painting the water gold. My lungs burned, but my chest felt lighter than it had in years. I thought about Dad, about the lessons he gave me in fragments. Maybe he had believed Daniel was the heir, but in the end, he had left me a key. I used it, not to guard his empire, but to build my own. That was my inheritance, whether he realized it or not. At Harbor North's new office, I gathered my small team. We were young, scrappy, but determined. I looked around the room, faces bright with hope, not fear. "We're not here to chase spotlights," I told them. We're here to build something that lasts, something rooted in respect. Their applause was quiet, but it was real. And for once, I didn't need louder. I stood by the window that evening, San Francisco glittering beneath me. The skyline felt like a mirror, unfinished, chaotic, but alive. I whispered the words I had once been too afraid to say. I stood up for myself. I reclaimed my worth. And this time, I didn't whisper them to convince myself. I whispered them because they were true. Months passed, and the firestorm that had consumed Lone Star settled into ash. Daniel still tried to claw his way back. Press conferences, interviews, even apologies that sounded more like excuses. Harper faded into the background once her family's capital was gone, her smile no longer useful. My parents called once or twice, voices softer, almost pleading, but I let the phone ring. I wasn't cruel, I was clear. Respect had never lived in that house, and I wasn't stepping back inside just because the walls had cracked. My life had changed in ways I couldn't have predicted. Harbor North was no longer a quiet lattice in the shadows. It was a recognized force. Investors who once ignored me now request meetings. Reporters asked for quotes, but I rarely gave them. Power wasn't about being loud. It was about choosing when to speak. And when I did, it mattered. Still, the greatest shift wasn't in business. It was in me. The girl who once begged for a seat at their table now understood something simple. I didn't need their table. I had built my own. And at mine, respect was the only invitation. I hosted dinners with my team, laughter echoing off loft walls, no chandeliers needed. I ran along the bay at dawn, lungs burning, heart steady. I found peace not in their approval, but in my own reflection. One evening, Rachel Morgan from Compass House asked me over coffee, "Do you ever think about reconciling?" I let the question hang, stirring cream into my cup. "Reconciliation without change is just repetition," I said. "I don't need to repeat that life." She nodded, and I knew she understood. Healing didn't mean going back. Healing meant moving forward without chains. Inside, I still revisited the question that once haunted me. Was I selfish for choosing myself? Was I cruel for letting them fall? But every time the doubts rose, I answered with the truth I had earned. I stood up for myself. I reclaimed my worth. And I wasn't going back. Circularity wrapped itself around my story. From the wobbly chair by the kitchen to the corner office in San Francisco, from silence at the family table to speeches in rooms I controlled, from invisibility to clarity. The circle wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Now I want to ask you, the one listening, when family betrays you, when loyalty becomes a chain instead of a bond, what do you choose? Do you stay silent for the sake of blood? Or do you fight for the sake of your worth? Have you drawn a line and said, "No more"? Share your story in the comments. Tell me if you're Team Isabella, or if you still believe Daniel deserved forgiveness. Because here's the truth. Family is not about obligation. It's about respect. And your worth isn't defined by their recognition. It's defined by the moment you refuse to disappear. I raise my glass of water. Not champagne, not wine, but clear, simple water. And toast to the life I built, the boundaries I drew, the freedom I claimed. Betrayal shaped me, but peace defined me. From the kitchen to the skyline, I found my place, and it was never theirs to give. When I look back, it's almost surreal. A single seat by the kitchen set everything in motion. 10 words in an email stripped the mask from their intentions. 3 words on a phone call buried their empire. Betrayal didn't break me. It revealed me. For years, I believed my worth was measured by their approval, that silence was loyalty, that endurance was love. But silence without respect is erasure, and endurance without boundaries is surrender. The day I stopped waiting for them to see me was the day I finally saw myself. I won't pretend it was easy. Cutting ties with family is like carving away pieces of yourself. The guilt lingered. The doubts whispered. But every time I asked, was I selfish for choosing myself? The answer echoed clearly. I wasn't selfish. I was surviving. And survival became freedom. Today, Harbor North thrives. Not because I shouted, not because I demanded recognition, but because I built carefully, patiently, quietly, until the moment I chose to be loud. That's the lesson I want you to carry. Your worth isn't defined by the seat they give you. It's defined by the empire you choose to build when they push you aside. From betrayal to peace, my journey wasn't about revenge alone. It was about reclamation, of voice, of boundaries, of dignity. I stood up for myself. I reclaimed my worth. And I will never apologize for that. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been sidelined by the very people who should have lifted you up? Have you fought for your place? Or are you still waiting for permission to be seen? Drop your story in the comments. Be honest. Be bold. This isn't just my story. It belongs to everyone who's ever been underestimated, silenced, or erased. And if this story resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their worth is not defined by family approval, that respect is not optional, that silence can be broken. Hit like if you believe justice can come from standing your ground. Subscribe if you want more stories where betrayal meets its reckoning and silence finally finds a voice. Because one truth will always remain. Family is not about obligation. It's about respect. And respect is the foundation of peace. So raise your glass with me, not to them, but to yourself. To the boundaries you've drawn, to the battles you've fought, to the peace you've earned. They tried to bury you in silence, but silence can be sharpened into power, and when the moment comes, you'll know what to say.